All right, so this is 21, Augustine. Augustine's Confessions, which is one of the most influential books in the Western tradition. What is this book famous for doing? What is it famous for being the first thing of? It is considered the first autobiography and the first memoir. Really, for the first time, the first-person narrator. This is the first complete and sustained work that we know of like that. So let's jump into this text, because I found it, and I don't know what you guys thought, but I found it actually a text which just felt very modern and contemporary. The emotions and the thoughts. It's really the story of a soul, and as we noted, it's a father of both the modern novel and psychology, in the sense of it being really a story of a person and his journey. Also, in terms of psychology, it really does have some insights. Like the other boys, I did not want to keep my nose in a book. We loved to play. Those who punished us, meanwhile, played their own adult games, which they called business. All human concerns seem in the end just children's games. So again, this is kind of psychology. It's sort of taking an ironic perspective and saying, well, these grown-ups are really just big kids. And they call their games business, or they call their games love or romance, but they're still just playing games. This is a new consciousness that we're seeing, a kind of self-critical looking behind the surface of things and kind of seeing them a different way. He goes on and says that he had no love for reading books, and he hated it when his teachers forced him to study. To stimulate learning, free curiosity has more power than rigorous coercion. No one does right if he acts against his will, even when forced to do the right thing. And that ties into something. Remember when Cassiodorus was saying that we shouldn't forcibly convert the Jews? So there's a similar sentiment expressed here by Augustine. What you do has to be voluntary. You shouldn't force people to do stuff. And this is also a new kind of thing, and a political freedom. Because God gave us free will, it's wrong to force people to do stuff. And then he talks about reading Virgil. They made me read Virgil. I had to learn about the wanderings of some legendary fellow named Aeneas. I wept over the death of his lover Dido, who took her own life from love. I favored these empty fables over more useful studies. I relished the spectacle of the wooden horse and the burning of Troy. So those are all things that we read about in our readings from Virgil. So I wanted you to kind of get a sense of the same stuff that everyone else was reading, so that what they say about it makes sense. Here's another point which seems to be a point of psychology. He said, one single desire dominated my search for delight. I just wanted to give and get love. That was interesting. A lot of times what people do, they're just trying to get love, right? So sometimes when people act in ways that are strange, or they're angry, or whatever else, the basic human drive for love is important. And he said, a lot of the stuff he did, he was just looking for love. He was searching for love. And then he talks about discovering Cicero and what happens when he reads Cicero. He had kind of an epiphany, we call it. So Augustine in the Confessions is a very epiphanic writer. In fact, I think I counted 3 epiphanies here. First, when he's reading Cicero, then when he encounters this kind of homeless beggar, drunk guy in Milan, and then when he is going to convert to Christianity, he has an epiphany there too. So he kind of has these moments of revelation. And here's the one in Milan, the epiphany in Milan. He says, as I passed along a Milan street, I noticed a destitute beggar. He had gotten drunk, and he had carried on joking and laughing. The beggar seemed happy, while I felt racked with anxiety. He had no worries, while I lived frenetically. He had acquired wine by wishing good luck to passers-by, whereas I made money by telling lies. That night the beggar would sleep off his intoxication, but I would sleep and rise with mine forever. If anyone had asked me if I would prefer to feel merry or panicked with fear, I would have said merry. Yet if anyone had asked whether I would prefer to beg like that merry man or keep living as I did, I would have chosen to remain my miserable self. So this sets him up, I think, to sort of considering what's wrong with my life. Remember in Ratatouille, when Remy comes crashing out that window and he freezes in midair and he says, I think it's apparent I need to rethink my life. Remember that? The movie starts out with that. Well, I think this was one of those I need to rethink my life moments for Augustine. He's saying, How come this homeless guy seems so happy and I'm so miserable? And then the world would call me successful. I'm making all this money teaching rhetoric, teaching people to argue court cases and teaching them to make speeches. And I'm a man about town. I have this position in Milan. I have all these friends. And yet he's happy and I'm miserable. So Augustine has this circle of friends in Milan, and which includes his friend Alpius, whom he admires very much for his character. And they have this club of philosophers. We shared an interest in the life of the mind. The happy life, we thought, lay in probing difficult questions. But our grandiose contemplations face mundane obstacles. To seek truth for a living, we would have to marry wives with some money to support us. Alpius discouraged this idea. He feared that once married, we could no longer live together in carefree leisure for the love of wisdom. We wanted to withdraw into the contemplative life, but we doubted whether the wives we wanted to acquire would accept this. On this doubt, our whole well-planned project collapsed and we abandoned it. With sighs and groans, we returned to careers conforming to the well-trodden ways of the world. I had become a grown man. So how does this failure of this grandiose intellectual project mark his growing up and becoming a grown man? How does that, do you think, mark a passage into adulthood? And how is Augustine actually defining adulthood in that case? A lot of times, adulthood is considered to be a giving up of childish ideals or unrealistic expectations. And a mature adult point of view would be to say, you know what, I'm probably not going to be a gold medal Olympic skater and president of the United States and have a #1 Billboard chart hit. When you're a kid, it seems like anything's possible. And then as you get older, you're like, well, maybe I had to pick one thing and, focus on it. And there's a certain disillusionment with getting older, a lot of people find. And they look back on their youthful dreams as sort of seeming kind of foolish and unrealistic. And I think Augustine is looking back in that sense and saying that when he gave up this grandiose project devoted to wisdom, then that marked a more mature point of view. But in fact, Augustine does end up spending his whole life devoted to wisdom because he does become a major philosopher, a theologian as well. The climax of the thing is his conversion to Christianity. So let's walk through that because there's a lot of different steps. So the first thing is that Augustine says he'd been reading Cicero a dozen years before, and he thought he was going to seek wisdom, but he really didn't. So now he's thinking of how he can kind of seek wisdom really by becoming a Christian. And I think it's what he's seeing is that his original impulse to seek wisdom through Cicero wasn't going anywhere when he was living as a secular person. And that somehow this desire for wisdom was leading him to God. But he's such an unhappy young man that he says, famously, "Lord, make me good, but not yet." It's also sometimes said, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." I knew the day would come when I stood naked to myself and my conscience would complain against me. So it's this idea, oh, I want to be good, I want to be holy, but just not yet. There's other things I want to do. Maybe he wanted to have love affairs, or maybe he wanted to do something else. But, there is this idea. Sometimes you know that you want to do the right thing, but you're just not ready for it. And you know that you're going to do it, but you're just not ready yet. So then he goes into this garden. And he goes into this garden with his friend Alpius. And he throws himself down under a fig tree, Augustine does, and he starts crying. And his tears flow and flow. And this is a very famous painting. If you Google St. Augustine and you look at images, you'll see him painted under this fig tree, weeping with his head down, with a halo over his head, because he's a saint, so that's how they paint saints. He lets his tears flow, and he says, "How long, O Lord? How long? How long? Tomorrow, tomorrow. Why not now? Why not an end to my impure life in this hour?" And that also is very famous, that "How long, O Lord?" That's actually put into various hymns and songs, of Christian hymns and songs. And then, while he's saying this to himself, "How long, O Lord? How long?" what happens? He hears a voice in the neighboring yard. And the voice says, and he can't tell whether it's a boy or a girl, which itself is kind of interesting to me, an androgynous voice. It says and repeats, "Pick up and read, pick up and read." I had never heard of any children's song using that chant. I interpreted it as a divine command to open Alpius's book and read the first thing I found there. The book was the Bible. And there's this passage there, and I'm not sure why it was so significant to Augustine. It says, don't have these drunken parties and stuff, but just put on the garments of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I guess, really reading between the lines, one of the reasons that Augustine didn't want to become a chaste Christian, a pure Christian, was that he wanted to have riots and drunken parties. And he wanted to give in to the flesh and its lusts for a little while longer. And he knew that as a Christian, he wouldn't be allowed to do that, and his Christian friends wouldn't let him do that, and as a priest, he couldn't do that, because he does become a priest and a bishop. So at that point, because what he put his finger on in the Bible, just randomly, totally spoke to what was in his heart, he interpreted that too as God speaking to him. So God's spoken to him twice in this Epiphany. First, in the voice of a little boy or girl saying, pick up and read, which he hears from the other yard. And then God reaches out and touches him again, because the first random passage that he looks at in the Bible just states what's actually going on in his heart. So at that point, he gets up and all shadows of doubt dissolve. And then he puts his finger in the book, and Aeneas reads where he has his finger, and what Aeneas reads also says what's in Aeneas' heart. So that's like a third time that God's reached through in this scene. So at that point, they both go to Augustine's mother, and they say that they're going to be Christians. And his mother is very happy, because she's hoped for a long time she's a Christian, and she's hoped that he'll become a Christian. So with that, we kind of complete the section that we read. Okay, so let me just to close out Augustine by mentioning why he's so important. Augustine was the big theologian of Christianity for the first 800 years of the medieval period. So not until Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century does Christian philosophy really change much. So Augustine took a lot from Plato, and Augustine drew a sharp distinction between this world and the next world, and mind and body, and the true world that we're heading toward and the false world that we're living in. In fact, he wrote a book called The City of God, and he said there are two cities. There's the city of man and the city of God. And what we really should be living in is the city of God. He calls it the civitas Dei. In Latin, that means city of God. But Augustine's very important, and a lot of stuff that's in Christianity comes from him. This kind of emphasis on denying the body, Augustine was a big contributor to that. And then that Christianity changes a little bit in 800 years later when we get to Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas is much more of an Aristotle guy, and he's much more kind of interested in the world and what goes on in this world and how to live a good life in this life. And therefore, Aquinas, as we'll see, leads in many ways to the Renaissance and the reigniting of Greek and Roman ideas. Okay, so that's it. That's Augustine. We'll read more of him, like maybe in a future version of this course, because there's lots of Augustine to read, and he's a pretty good writer.